Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome everyone to the Eastside Freedom Library. This is going to be a great program tonight. I'm excited that we have two great activist scholars who are presenting, and lots of other activist scholars in the house, I'm sure. I'm Peter, co-founder here at the Eastside Freedom Library. And my partner Beth Cleary, who's in the back, is the other co-founder. And Yoich, who has helped make tonight happen. Yoich is on our board and is the interim director of the Immigration History Research Center. Lots of celebrities in the house. So one of the things that we're really trying to do here at the Eastside Freedom Library is create opportunities for people to share experiences across what some people think are boundaries. And so when we heard that the U, and particularly the African-American and African-American Studies Department at the U, was bringing Horace Huntley to town, and we had an event here in the fall with an activist from St. Paul's West Side who gave a presentation about how West Side Chicanos had fought to get Spanish language teaching into the St. Paul public schools. And he told the story that they were at a critical point in their struggle, and a group of Chicano students from the University of Minnesota had come to help them. And we did the math and realized that it was the same time, as the Morrill Hall action. Not necessarily January of '69, but it was certainly the same era. And so we started to think, when we knew Horace was coming, for an opportunity to put African-American studies and Chicano studies in a conversation, and to think about the activism of students of color at the University of Minnesota and more generally. So that's what we're hoping to do. It's interesting, I've asked, and Horace and Jimmy have not spoken to each other yet, so there is no script, so that should be interesting. And I also want to mention their activist scholarship, so I wanted to show off the books. One of the things that we're also trying to do here at the Eastside Freedom Library is get people to read books. And sign that guest book, please, sister. And particularly to read books in relationship to the programming that we're doing. So we're very proud that we have two books that Horace has put together: Black Workers' Struggles for Equality in Birmingham and Foot Soldiers for Democracy. And I want to say something about how those books came to be written. And then Jimmy's book, Ratsa Si Migra No, which he presented here about a year ago or so. And then this amazing book, Nerve Juice, The True Story of the Morrill Hall Takeover. So we have that as well. Horace's books, Horace did something at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute that for me is really a model of activist scholarship. And that is, they maintained a real guest book, something more substantial than what we have here. And in their guest book, people coming to visit the Civil Rights Institute were asked to check boxes like, I was fire hosed, I was tear gassed, I was beaten, I was arrested. And then they were asked for their phone numbers. And Horace spent, I don't know how many years, following up all the people who had signed those guest books and had those experiences, and doing their oral histories. And these two books represent compilations of those oral histories that he collected at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. So we like to say here at the Eastside Freedom Library that this is a place where new knowledge gets produced, not just that people access the knowledge that's on the shelves. And clearly when Horace was at the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, they were producing new knowledge all the while they were working. So let me call up this evening's speakers. Jimmy Patino of the History and Chicano Studies program at the U, and Horace Huntley, supposedly retired, Yeah. So come on up. I'm going to get out of the way. Yeah. All right.
Am I supposed to climb up here?
You all right on that?
Yeah,
I can get you some. No?
No. That was a joke.
Okay. All right. And so they both need to be turned on at the mic. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
You really need to.
Hello?
Hello.
Good evening. Okay, I had to skip out for a minute, so I didn't hear Peter's instructions. So I guess we'll wing it.
We can wing it.
Yes.
No, this is quite an honor. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. Thank you again for inviting me to this wonderful intellectual radical space. Nice to meet you, Dr. Huntley.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I think for me, this is very exciting to think through. As someone in an ethnic studies, one of the ethnic studies departments at the University of Minnesota, to engage and talk through and hear from folks who help create those dynamic spaces that without that work, without those struggles, I wouldn't be here, right? So I greatly appreciate that and I'm excited about that. And in particular, not just to mark an anniversary, I mean, we should celebrate it, right? But I'm interested in the struggle, right? The stories, the narratives
Yes.
that occurred, right? So I have several questions on that front and many others, but yeah.
Well, great. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always great to come back to Minnesota, although I'm glad I brought my coat. But we have enjoyed it. In fact, my wife loved Minnesota so much that she wanted to live here. And we did for 5 years, but that was enough for me. But yes, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this topic. Very, very important piece, of course, in our lives, because it really is one of those pieces that changes lives. When we were here in those early days, Minnesota was a different place at that time. It was a different place. I see John and Gopher here, and Mary, and our family, and I often tell the family that I am the reason that everybody is here, and if not for me, some of them wouldn't be here now. It's great to be invited over by Peter, and Peter is one of the best friends in the world. He, when we were at Pitt, I have to say this, Peter was not a basketball player. We played a lot of basketball, and I would always say, "Get on him tight, Peter." Peter was a pacifist then, he wouldn't check anybody very hard, but he was the greatest guy that you could ever meet. We spent a lot of time together. In fact, I was telling you this afternoon that Peter helped me to pack my U-Haul when we were leaving Pittsburgh to go back to Birmingham. So, well, let's move on. I can give you those kinds of stories.
Sure, no, and that's, you somewhat begin to cover my first question. As a fellow Southerner, I'm from Houston, Texas. What was it like arriving in Minnesota? Both the weather, right, but the social context, going to the university, so on and so forth.
Well, as I said, those were interesting times. I actually came to Minnesota. I wanted to go to Tuskegee, to undergraduate school. My wife and about 10 other classmates went to Tuskegee. I couldn't go, my mother couldn't afford to send me. So I decided if I was not going to Tuskegee, I wasn't going any place. So I joined the Air Force to see the world. And they sent me to Grand Forks, North Dakota. But there's something good about that. If not for that, I never would have seen North Dakota. So I went to North Dakota, spent 3 years, 9 months, 10 days, but who's counting? Yeah. And I came to Minneapolis to go to school, to an electronics school. When I arrived in Minneapolis, I knew I was in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I had never been here before, didn't know anyone here. I had a room at the Y, and Barbara and I had gotten married a year prior to them. So as soon as I could get an apartment, I could get my wife here. So I went out looking for an apartment, and each time I couldn't find anything. So I said, well, let me be smart about this. Let me call this place before I go. So I called and spoke to the owner of the building. And he said, sure, we have a place, just go by, and the landlord will show you the apartment. So I did. Got there, and the guy told me, should we have a place available? So I was going to pay my deposit. I ready to pay the deposit. He said, wait just a moment, don't pay the deposit yet. Let me be sure that it's available. So I knew it was available. I just talked to the owner 10 minutes earlier. So he came back and he said, oh, I'm so sorry. It was rented yesterday. Now, if I had had the ability, I would have started a riot right there on that floor that day. But I didn't have the ability to do that. But my point is, Minnesota had a, that was a public image, an image that I had of Minnesota that simply did not stand up. So that was my introduction to Minnesota. I had also in North Dakota 2 stories I tell about that. One is when I first got there, I went to a restaurant, sat down and eating. A woman came in with 2 children. They were probably 5 and 7, and the little boy kept staring at me. And his mother was trying to stop him from staring, and finally he couldn't take it any longer. He just said, Mommy, look at that funny kind of man. And I kind of smiled, and the mother was embarrassed. She said, oh, I'm so sorry, but he has never seen a black person before. This is Grand Forks, North Dakota, in 1961. I know some of you are saying, well, you don't look that old. I am. But Minnesota was a different place. But what I found is that it was different in several ways. It was different in that black folk in Minnesota at the time, the ones that I would meet, didn't see the same kinds of things that I saw. They didn't see the kinds of discrimination that was just intuitive. You know, had that sixth black Southern sense, and there was a difference. I see some of you nodding your heads, and so you understand what I'm saying. So the first 2 years, I didn't come to university. I came to university in '67. My wife encouraged me to come and get my undergraduate degree. And that is when I met some people here, like John and Gopher, Rosemary, but people at that point, many black folk did not speak. In the South, you see somebody, you don't speak to them. In fact, that was a saying in my community, that if you, when that boy walks past the house, if he walks past 5 times, he's going to speak 5 times. That's the way we were taught. But I would meet a black person on campus, and it's as if we didn't see each other.
Right.
But I could go on to it.
Well, what led to interactions on campus, and was there dialogue around the
Yes.
conditions? I mean, I'm sure that.
Well, yeah. In '67, when I got to the U, I didn't know anyone on campus, but I read the daily. And in the daily, we talked about the organization STRAP, Students for, what is it? Somebody help me.
No, I don't think I have. When we started it, I don't remember exactly.
In other words, students to improve relationship between blacks and whites. And Rosemary was very actively involved with STRAP. I was not involved. I was there to go to school. That's what I did.
The Rosemary Freeman?
Rosemary Freeman. The day that we met, we were on the quad and we were walking toward each other, and both of us, we didn't turn our head, we both spoke at the same time. And that in itself was very significant to both of us because that had not been the case. So we stopped, we talked, and we became homeboy and homegirl at that time. She then invited me to a meeting of AAAC. It had changed to AAAC at that point. She invited me to a meeting of AAAC in Kaufman Union. And I went, and for the first time, I saw more than one black person in a particular spot. So then we started dialogue. I mean, they had started the dialogue. I became a part of that dialogue.
Okay.
And
So you arrived in '67 to the University of Minnesota,
Yes.
began attending. '68, of course, a turbulent year in American history broadly, particularly thinking about the assassination of Dr. King. What do you recall as, I guess, the dialogues continued in these organizational spaces, the students' responses to this national context in '68 and,
yes.
and translating it locally?
Right.
Yeah.
Rose and I both worked for the organization here. I worked, Barbara and I volunteered with Sabathani Community Center. It was led by Bill English in South Minneapolis. Rosemary volunteered at The Way in North Minneapolis, which meant that we then had connections with both North and South Minneapolis. John, I believe you were from St. Paul.
I'm with the inner city youth league.
Yeah,
St.
the
Paul,
inner
the
city,
sister organization
inner
of
city
the way.
league was available. So we had that connection with the community.
Right.
And that was one of our strong points, because the community would come and assist us wherever. We were fortunate that we had some brothers who were playing football and basketball who supported what we were attempting to do. Now, they could not support in the same manner that we did on a regular basis, but not until the takeover took place. But at that same time, Stokely Carmichael had been invited to the U, and I had the opportunity to meet him. I had also met and really studied with Mahmoud El-Kati, who was a local historian. I'm sure most of you are probably aware of Mahmoud. I had a situation where in a class, a huge class, probably 300, 400 people in that class, it was American history. And the professor talked about black people in about 10 minutes. So I raised the question. I said, well, are you going to talk more about Black history? And he arrogantly said, is there more? So it was on then. This is So he said, well, I'll give you equal time. I said, well, does that mean I'll have the rest of the term to correct some of what you have created here? He said, I'll give you a class period. And he said, by the way, I will invite my teaching assistants, my graduate assistants, and some of my colleagues to come. And I felt he was attempting to intimidate me at that point. I said, well, do you think you could get Williams Arena and get WCCO out? He said, I'll give you one class period. So he gave me a class period. Now, here I am, never given a lecture before. I'm as scared as all get out. So I then try to find my move to get him to do the lecture. So Mark told me, so no, you can do it. He said, go and get John Hope Franklin and look through, get some of these things there. And I did. And I gave the lecture. And I knew that I had done, you know how you do something, you know that you've done a good job. I knew that I had done a good job. So I asked him, so how did I do? He said, well, you did fine. He said, well, you did good. I said, well, in the back of my head, I knew that I had done well. I said, well, as a result of that, I would like for that lecture to go in lieu of my final exam. He said, oh, sure. I had a C out of post. I was upset. Wow. But this is what is happening, you know. And that was right in the middle of the civil rights and Black Power movement. I met Stokely Carmichael. You know, we had conversation with Rose and with Ida Elam, who was a student on campus. She had been here for a while. With Mark, and all of those variables coming together had prepared me for what was about to happen. And
how did those, so you come up with the demands after Dr. King's assassination,
right.
And you're creating this dynamic, this critical reflection and debate. What did those conversations look like? What were there points of contention? I'm sure there was plenty of points of agreement. What do you recall?
There were both. There were always points of contention. And in fact, I'll just take you from, initially, of course, I was not a part when they made those initial demands. The demands there were 7 demands, and they have been issued to the university right after Dr. King's assassination. So from spring term all the way through the winter term, there were discussions that I basically wasn't a part of until, I guess the fall term.
Because there was lag, right,
yes,
between the demands coming out and
exactly,
any kind of response. Right?
Exactly. And so the discussion was about, well, why have we not had any response? And we were talking about, well, what can we do since we have not had those responses? So we consistently talked about what was happening. We saw what was happening in other places in the nation,
Right.
that student organizations were creating a whole new atmosphere. Even the students at Howard University, Black University, they called it at that time a Negro University. They made a demand that they wanted Howard to become a Black university. And they took over their administration building. Of course, many people are aware of what took place at Cornell. In fact, let me just tell you that my son told me, he said, Dad, you're going to talk about the takeover of Morrill Hall. I said, yeah. He said, well, I want you to tell them the story about the takeover at Cornell. He went to Cornell, and he called one night at midnight and said, Dad, guess what we just did? I said, what did you? He said, well, we just took over the administration building. I said, what? He said, we just took over the administration building. I said, well, I didn't send you there to take over the administration. He said, well, you did it. That was different. So
years later.
This is years later. Years later. This was in the 90s. But he told me that he wanted me to tell you guys that so that you would know what a hypocrite I am. But we talked about what we could do to encourage the administration to move on our demands. We planned a Black Student Conference, and I was the chair of the establishment of that conference. And we had James Turner, who at that time was a graduate student at Northwestern. He was finishing up his doctorate. And he came and he spoke. We had Muhammad Ali here. We had Black Rose and her dance troupe from New York City. We had quite a few folk that came in. And we had students from all over the country, from California, from the East. And in that conference, of course, we made contact with people who were having some of the same kinds of problems that we were having. Mm-hmm. So we saw that this was not just a local issue. This was a national issue. So we decided in January then to go to the administration building and have an impromptu meeting with the president. He happened not to be in town at that time. So we set up a meeting for the following day. And the following day, we were to meet with him at 1 o'clock. He contacted us and said, well, we knew that we were having a AAAC meeting just before the meeting with the administration. He wanted to come to our meeting. And we said, no, we have business to attend to, so we didn't want any interruption in that. So during that meeting, we were talking about how do we answer to try to get the administration to move, and we couldn't come up with a solution. So the meeting came at 1 o'clock. We simply decided to leave the meeting at Compton Union, and we went on to the administration building. Probably 30 or 40 of us, and we went in and asked for, a response. Mm-hmm. And the response was not the response that we wanted to hear. So we decided to end the meeting. When we ended the meeting, Rose and I stood, everybody else stood, and we decided to leave. We went down the stairway, but rather than going left, and you may notice in Derby's, there's a piece in there called a sharp right turn. We made a sharp right turn into the bursar's office, and we then had all of the offices in the bursar's office to close. We wouldn't allow anyone else in, but anyone could leave, So that was the beginning of the takeover.
Right. This was planned beforehand?
It was
impromptu.
It was impromptu.
Yeah.
We could not agree. Some wanted to.
So this is one of the points of contention.
Yes.
Tactics and
what are we going? What kind of action would we take?
Right.
And we couldn't agree on those
movements happen.
Right? But it happened, and many people that was with us, they stayed with us, but others left. Mm-hmm. But we was there for 12 hours, and we negotiated.
So you were there 12 hours. The administrators came to meet and negotiate.
Yeah, we negotiated.
How did those, what were the dynamics of that conversation and how did that?
Well, we are a bunch of students who decided that what we had wanted, though they were administrators who, quote, knew what we needed. But we eventually came to a point where they understood that we were very serious about what we were attempting to do. And of course, at that time, we were down to 3 demands. And one was development of the MLK program, assistance in the development of the student conference, and thirdly, the development of the African-American Studies Department. And of course, we're talking about establishment of a program and a disciplinary program, but we would not give in on that. So we actually got all 3 of those activated.
Fantastic. So soon after, you were one of the first graduates.
Yeah, Rose and I were the first 2 graduates of the program, of the department.
What, as the department developed the curriculum, the faculty, what role did students play, and how was it, navigating that?
Yeah, well, the students were very actively involved, and we knew that we needed faculty. We were involved in the selection of faculty. We were involved with the courses that would be offered. We were involved with the selection of the chair of the department. So we were intimately involved. And so we actually moved sort of our headquarters from Kaufman Union to the African American Studies Department, and that became home. That was our home, Right. And we looked at it as being something that we owned.
Sure.
And we were very protective of it.
Right.
And we wanted to see how we could improve the curriculum from a Black perspective. And we spent a lot of time.
So students
in this
sat
space
alongside faculty
Yes.
to make these kinds of decisions. I think this is a larger narrative nationally where Chicano studies programs, American Indian studies programs, Black studies programs, initially, or departments, right, initially students participate.
Yes.
Maybe one because of lack of PhDs of color and professors of
Yes.
color to come in to work with them, but also because of its grassroots goals.
Right. And we wanted also to ensure there would be a very close association with the community. Therefore, a person like Mahmoud was one of our first professors.
Sure.
And but we had people students who were very, very knowledgeable. One that stands out in particular was a sister. She was she lived in Philadelphia for a while. She may have been from Tennessee. Anna Stanley. And Anna was just brilliant. Anna, I remember once having a discussion with Alan Spear, and Alan taught African American history on campus. And I was having a discussion with him, and we were in opposition. And he was arguing one point, and I was arguing another. And he said, well, where did you get your? I said, well, Anna said, he said, oh, okay, if Anna said it. She was so well read. From our perspective, Anna had read everything ever written because she could relate to anything. She could comment on anything, and she was dynamic. And she was, So Anna, Sister Rose, Marie Braddock, those sisters, they sort of led that particular area. Marie was the secretary of the organization. But it was just a dynamic period, and we had the opportunity to meet students from other places that were going through some similar kinds of occurrences.
I heard an interview, I think on NPR, with John Wright, Professor John Wright, recalling some of these incidents, and he remembered that the founding of the African American Studies Department was deeply related to the founding of other departments later, interactions between other communities of color and allies and whatnot. What do you recall in relationship to folks from different communities interacting?
Well, we interacted. See, I left in '70 after I finished up. I left. But prior to that, we had been involved with Native American, with AIM, the organization, American Indian Movement, and very closely associated with them. I don't remember, well, I guess there was some interaction with Chicano, and
We were founded in 1971, too.
Yeah.
So that was,
there was not a lot happening before I left with other than American Indian Movement.
Sure, sure. Tell us about that. There was a relationship with AIM, and what do you recall from those interactions?
Well, anytime that we had something going, we could always call on them. If they had something going, they could call on us. But there was, in the Franklin Avenue area, where a lot of poverty, with people who had been brought in from some of the reservations, there was always something that needed attending to. And there was a relationship between a few of us on campus and Native Americans. I can't recall specifically what was happening, but I knew that we cooperated in several ways.
Sure, sure. And when you say we could call on them, that's familiar to me, having interviewed civil rights activists. Being able to call on, to me, that's a language of solidarity. We could call on this community. Sure. We could call on such and such individual or organization to show up, right, to events.
And that relationship with Sebastian on the south side and with the way on the north side, and Tennessee, usually in St. Paul, all of those were very key to the success of what we were attempting to do. But some have said that the community was involved with the takeover. We were not involved with the takeover. They came in after the takeover to assist us and to give us a hand, give us suggestions on what we can do. But the actual takeover was totally students, totally student-led. And we called Spike Moss from the south, from the way, Seal Davis, Bill English from South Minneapolis, and all came. So there was that kind of community involvement that was quite important for the success of what we were attempting to do.
Thinking forward, how did these experiences, this student activism, creating the space of African American studies, the curriculum, the education, how did it lead to the next parts of your life? Because we're both historians, fellow historians, right? How did it lead to that part of your life?
Well, I actually came to university when I first got there. I was majoring in business administration. And somebody asked me to go, why? I want to make some money. But then I got involved with Mark Mood and the community and I saw another need out there. And I just became engrossed with the history, of Black history, because when I first met Mark, he was coming over to Sebastian to do a lecture on Black history. I said, well, I don't need that. And somebody said, well, why not? I said, because I'm Black. I don't really know Black history. Yeah, but I didn't even know who John Hope Franklin was at the time. But I felt since I had come up under the tutorage of my grandmother, Annie Scarborough, who fed me what I call nerve juice, that I knew it. But of course, after I started to study, I just became engrossed with it, and I changed from business to history, and then finally from history to African-American studies. And I met Mark Mood in undergraduate school, met in my master's program, met a brother by the name of Odie Scruggs at Syracuse, and then I met David Montgomery at the University of Pittsburgh and Peter. So all of that coming together, I had no other alternative than to go the direction that I went.
Sure. And especially collecting, well, you know, writing the history of the civil rights movement, but collecting oral histories, interviews, memories of folks. How did those fit in with the larger goals that were established with Black Studies initially?
Yeah. Well, when I returned to Birmingham, there was the discussion, development of the Institute, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute had already started. In 1980, I was appointed not director. We were attempting at that point to put the program together, to just talk about what an institute would be like. So myself and the previous mayor were co-directors or whatever of that organization to talk about how we would proceed. And we started simply by getting other folk involved, but at that point, 1980, Birmingham, Alabama, it was not 2019 Birmingham, Alabama. There were a lot of folk who said, well, you know, you really don't need to do that. Let the dead remain dead. We don't need to talk about that. Of course, we are just the opposite.
Sure. This is coming from the establishment?
This is coming from the establishment. And those people who had money, so they would have a say in what would happen. We didn't have money, but we had know-how in terms of getting points over. So we created that task force, and the task force then had charge of putting together the program for the development of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And we worked for about 5 years. And we came up with the idea with the philosophy and all, but we didn't come up with the monies. So that would take another few years to do. But because of my background from University of Minnesota, from South Minneapolis, from Pittsburgh, from Syracuse, and these folk that I had met, I had a perspective that would feed into what the Institute would eventually become. And it led, what I wanted to see also was that relationship with the Institute, and that relationship should also be relative to the community. So one of the things that I wanted to see was the development of an oral history project that was getting the story of people who had been very actively involved but did not have a voice. You know, all of us knew of the Martin Luther Kings, the Fred Shortishworths, and other individuals such as that. But we didn't know the people who would actually made up the movement.
Sure.
So we developed that project, and that became a centerpiece of the movement. I mean, not of the movement, but of the institute. And it created a situation where we would have a place that we could actually talk about the movement and about race. We did not have that place prior to the development of the institute.
Sure.
Even at the university, except in my class, there was not much happening as far as giving people a voice to deal with those kinds of issues.
It's interesting to hear that theme, starting here at the U, creating spaces where folks can talk about things otherwise folks weren't talking about, and to critically reflect.
Yeah. And I think that it actually starts much earlier than that.
Sure.
Because I mentioned my grandmother. And so she was feeding me nerve juice. And I remember once, this guy had a service station. His family had a service station, and they were known Ku Klux Klansmen. And, but, you know, everybody's, it was the only store, so we went out to, you know, as I was 9, 10 years old, I'd go out to buy candy or whatever. So I went out one day and I wanted to mail a letter, but they didn't have a stamp. So I asked him, the man, Mr. Pierce, if he would mail this letter for me. He said, what do you want me to do? Lick the stamp for you too? So I just turned around and left. And I refused to go back. And my grandmother went out to the store one day and he asked her, is that boy still mad? And she told him, well, he has a mind of his own. And she came back and told me that, and she said, Mr. Pierce was still upset with you. And he said, she said, but I just want you to know, you did the right thing. And that was that nerve. That's all I needed for Mama to tell me. Mama told me it was right. So my grandmother was and she was sort of the catalyst.
Sure.
She would give me the nerve that I needed to do the thing.
I was going to say that the story you said about the classroom where you're challenging the professor, where did that, you know, insistence on challenging the situation come from? And that's, I think, starting to answer that.
Yeah, Birmingham was a different place. There are certain things that we learned, like growing up in Birmingham, because you know you had to learn certain things in order to survive. People ask, well, how could you face the Klan? There were instances when the Klan would come through the communities, and our parents would always say, when they come, get inside, close the door, and turn the lights off. Well, one night, we were 13, 14, 15 maybe, and we were on the corner at this little delicatessen, and the Klan rode through with their hoods on. But this time, we had decided we were going to make a statement the next time they rode through, so we did. We had piled up rocks, and we threw rocks at them. And man, we headed home. Got home, I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time a car came near our house, I knew it was the Klan coming to get me. But they didn't catch any of us. The only problem with that is somebody else paid for that. Some other black children paid for that. Because they did not catch the ones of us that perpetrated it. But we had made a determination that we were not going to just allow them to terrorize our community and not make a statement. So that was our statement.
So the defiance is rooted
Yes.
in Birmingham.
Right. I can remember once the police came through the neighborhood and they picked up one of my friends and they threw him in the back seat of the car. And the back seat of the car was a German Shepherd. And, you know, the German Shepherd did what he normally does. He created havoc for the friend. But this is what they could do without any consequences, basically. So our consequences, I guess we could say, they had to have been sort of guerrilla warfare. And so we had to learn how to do certain things and get away.
Absolutely. Well, so much. Thinking more about your research and your work and collecting oral histories and the focus on workers, how did that develop in relationship to civil rights?
That's a good question. When I got to Pittsburgh, I had a master's degree. I had a master's at Syracuse. I taught for a year at Maryland Eastern Shore. And I went to Pitt. And people said, oh, you went to study with David Montgomery, huh? I didn't know David Montgomery. In fact, I didn't know that there was a discipline called labor history. Because the people that I had studied with, they usually, normally when we talked about black history and black research, we were talking about looking at the elites and those folks who had made it. But when I got to Pittsburgh, I met David and he said, you're from Birmingham? I said, yeah. He said, well, we started to talk about my family. I said, well, my grandfather was an iron ore miner. And that struck up a conversation with David, and then I started taking the courses in labor history. And I didn't, before then, I had never thought about doing a history of working class. And I said to myself, well, you mean I can do a history of my granddaddy and the mine mill and smelter workers union? So we found out there was little history, no history really on the International Union of Mine Mill and Smelter Workers. And David kept telling me about different things that were happening in other areas. So I then became very, very interested in looking at Mine Mill, the organization of iron ore miners in Jefferson County. He encouraged me. I found out that there was maybe there was a chapter in one book talked about Mine Mill. And Peter was very instrumental in helping me, in directing me, because he was an old line labor historian by then. You know. So I then started looking for materials on Mine Mill, that was the organization in the iron ore mines on the mountain in Jefferson County. There were like 13 mines on the mountain, and each one of them were organized by Mine Mill. Mine Mill was an interracial union. You imagine an interracial union in Birmingham, Alabama, 1933. That was tough. Right. That was tough. So I actually got to meet some of those men who established Mine Mill during that period.
Right.
And Asbury Howard, Marion Reynolds, these are men. And Marion Reynolds, I have to tell you this story. Marion Reynolds, when I first talked with him, I called him on the phone, and he had a voice like this, a big voice. Voice bigger than Gopher. And so I knew that he was 7 feet tall, weighed about 300 pounds. first time I went to his house, I knocked on his door, and this man came to the door, this little man came to the door, and he spoke, and I knew that couldn't have been Mr. Reynolds, because he was about 5'5", 5'6", and he was maybe 125 pounds. But he was one of those leaders who organized Mind Meal on the Mountain. He told me, he said, son, let me tell you this before we even get started. He said, Martin Luther King could not have come to Birmingham if not for Mind Meal. You know, that was alien to me. And I said, yes, sir. I didn't believe him, but it turns out that they laid the foundation in Birmingham for the movement to come. And in fact, Fred Shuttlesworth, who was the leader of the movement in Birmingham, lived in one of the mining camps. That's where he was born and raised, in that mining camp. So, and of course we know about the UMW and eventually the Western Federation of Miners earlier, but this became very, very significant to me, especially after I found out my granddaddy was a miner, and he was a member of Mind Meal. And then my father came out of the military, out of the Navy. He went into the mines, worked for a very brief period after he returned, got in a fight with a white man in the mine, beat him up. They arrested him, put him in jail in Brownsville. Brownsville was a place that no black person want to be caught after dark. They put him in jail there, and then they threatened him. That they were going to kill him if he didn't leave it. So he actually left and went to Michigan. So all of that then created an urge in me to learn more and to research more and get it out to people so that they would know exactly what happened with those working class people.
No, I could identify with the epiphany of learning about these dynamic, often multiracial union spaces in the 1930s.
Yes.
Many of my mentors, labor historian Gerald Horn, for example, was somebody who, these interracial unions in Alabama, Mississippi, and places like that. How did that shift your perspective of African American history?
Well, as a result of that, I wanted to make sure that those who were on the ground got their stories told as well. Give them a voice, because that's what, Mind Meal really didn't have a voice in Birmingham prior to the work that I did to get that piece out. So it created, that was a journey. That was a process by which I had to go through in order to get there. But it created within me a desire to make sure that working class people and people who had been faceless and voiceless would also have be recognized.
Absolutely.
For what they've done.
Right. No, and again, I see, the beginnings of African American studies at the U of M and creating those spaces in order to excavate those voices. Right. It's the same trajectory, I think. It's why it's so important that space was created.
And I had a discussion about what's in a name. I talked about that with someone the other day, and I pulled this piece out of Nerd Juice, and I said, name is everything. But I just want to share just a little piece of this with you. I said, we talk about, whether we were colored or Negro, and some, of course, would use derivations of those terms. And black people answer to all of the terms colored, Negro, Negra, nigger. Some answer with hand in hand, and others with fire in their tongues and in their bellies. That juncture of our history, many people of African descent were disrespected and were totally disdainful of being termed black or African. We had swallowed the white or Hollywood value judgments with African features and black skin. Intuitively, we knew that Tarzan was not the king of the jungle, wherever the jungle was, that Stephen Fletcher and Aunt Jemima were not representative of black men and women, that buckwheat was a figment of the white imagination, and that Egypt was in Africa. But in America, it was disrespectful to tell white people that we knew these things. So in the main, we didn't tell them. You know, there were always exceptions to this rule. W.B. Du Bois told white America that we knew these things when he said the problem of the 20th century was the problem of the color line. Ida B. Wells said it when she demanded an anti-lynching law. Marcus Garvey shouted out the obvious when he said Africa for the Africans. Mary McLeod Bethune illustrated it when she joined Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. Martin Luther King declared it when he uttered, "While we can't wait," and Malcolm bellowed it out when he said, "By any means necessary." The point that I'm raising here is that all of this was part of that process that we had to go through to get to that place that we were going. We're still not there, but we're still headed that way. Du Bois made an analogy once. He said that this brother was standing on this platform waiting for the train to pass. And each day the train would come, it would stop, but it would not allow him to enter. One day, the train stopped, allowed him to enter. He got on the train, and the train took off, and he stood there for a minute. He said, "Well, you know, I hadn't considered something. I've been wanting to get on this train all this time, but I'd never asked the question, where's the train going?" So I think we started to ask that question, where's the train going, before we make the entrance. But we're still doing some of that. We don't really know where it's going.
Now that makes me think, I'm thinking more in the, as we get more to the contemporary moment, the global world that we live in, thinking about the name of the department, African-American and African Studies, right? And thinking about diaspora, migration, global relationships. How did that add to your repertoire of how you were thinking through these things?
Vitally important. The children of the 1960s heard the things that I just mentioned. And as a result, we were trying to take it to another level. And I think we did to a great extent. Black became beautiful. You know, black is beautiful. I remember driving up on 46th and Nicollet Avenue one day. I had a service station, and I pulled in and had a sign on my car that said, "Black is beautiful." And this guy looked at me and he said, "Black ain't beautiful." And so we had a discussion about that. In addition to that, Africa was acknowledged as the motherland. Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Mali, Malawi, Zaire, and we could go on and on and on. they were winning their freedom by any means necessary. The names of anti-imperial African leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, all these became household names. So we are being transformed and transforming ourselves as a result of having the opportunity to see these kinds of movements taking place. And our having really something to do with them because we're feeding off of each other. You know, the nationalists in the African context, looking at what's happening in this country, we're looking at what is happening there, and it is having that impact that we could never bag off of any longer. So, you know, when we start to look at how we're evolving over time, you know, it's having an impact not just upon what is happening at any one time, but where would we go with that? And as a result of the kinds of studies that we were doing, impact studies, this was giving us more information and helping to develop that nerve juice that we needed to do more than just what was happening in a book or in a classroom. It would help us to be more cognizant of what is taking place around us, and also how do we deal with those kinds of issues. So I think African American studies, Black studies, Chicano studies, you know, Native American, all would have a very positive impact upon how the world would be as a result of what we were able to, you know, to accomplish.
Sure. Absolutely. And speaking of feeding off each other, right? I have to ask, in 2015, I don't know if you're familiar with this, the Who's Diversity student movement occupied Morrill Hall. You know, I was one of the few members in Chicano Studies, and that was one of the demands to not only, in fact, the demands looked very much like your demands,
Right. Yes.
you know, almost 50 years before. So where are we now in terms of, we've created the spaces, right? We're still here. The spaces are still there. But there's still students and faculty and others who are still struggling to get those spaces resourced, to diversify the academy, and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts?
Where are we? That's a good question. In many instances, we are at the same place that we were at that time. And in some instances, we're probably worse off now than we were then. Well, some of us, we have not really done what we need to do to keep that fire burning. And we've had we have more distractions now. And some of us feel that we've made it. You know, we've made it to the promised land. So just to even to discuss, you know, just for instance, I've talked with people who are still attempting to live out this new structure, this new understanding that we have. And in many cases, you become ostracized. you become, rather than an asset, you become just the opposite. Even in your communities, we've well, we have not reached that level because there are fewer people that now that are doing this kind of work. There were more people doing this kind of work back in the day. So you had more of a community, for instance, here, I would venture to say that yourself, Peter, Huge, the few folk who are still doing that kind of work now, you're not getting the same kind of assistance. And you also are getting people who, well, not people, but institutions who are not on the same wavelength. So you're not getting the same kind of assistance that one could get. I don't know how many Way community centers, Savannah community centers you have here. The East Side Library is very important at this point. The educational institution that has created space. And you have people who are coming here and you have a place to discuss the kinds of issues that are necessary to discuss. But then you have you have a Donald Trump,
Sure.
who is creating a different kind of space,
Right.
that is in total opposition to what progressives are attempting to do. And we have to be very careful about how we deal with that. Because, well, for any number of reasons, but that's a huge topic that we need to deal with. And I think some of us are, but mostly, and we're getting more people into that discussion. And because he keeps his mouth open so long, he's helping as well. By the same token, there are those out there that has been legitimized by what he's doing and saying.
Sure. So again, where we started, the contestation for space, I think, is,
Yes, that's,
thank you, Dr. Huntley.
thank you.
Questions?
When I toured the institute, if you let us on a tour, you told us about how the kids went to jail because their folks couldn't afford to go to jail. They had to keep those jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their head, and how orchestrated it was that so many kids were arrested. They had to put those kids in holding pens outside because the jails were overflowing with people. It was an orchestrated crusade.
Yes.
That was community-wide. And today, I think there's a level of selfishness where people say, I got mine, now you go get yours. And it's not that community involvement like we had back in the day.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree, though, and I think that there's that kind of thing that is happening. But just as we have today, back in the day, most people think that Birmingham, all of the churches were involved. No. There was Fred Shuttlesworth Church. Everybody thinks that when you talk about movement churches, 16th Street Baptist Church and the 6th Avenue Baptist Church were totally involved. Not the case. Not until about 1961 or 62 did both of those, who were the two largest churches in the city at the time, did they get involved. The grassroots, the people who were actively involved, were people in churches that were basically working class people. So the 16th Street and 6th Avenue were the middle class, the upper middle class. They would become involved, but in the initial stages they were not. But the children who got involved, many of them got involved against the will of their parents. Because if I've had people to tell me that certain jobs would tell them if their children were arrested, they would get fired. And that became a mantra, and parents knew that. But children obviously would get involved anyway. There were 3,000 to 4,000 children that were arrested during the Children's Crusade in May of 1963. They actually filled the jails, and then they started taking kids to the fairgrounds. And they were housed at the fairgrounds, and they would pick them up in school buses to transport them to various places. But yeah, you're correct in that there were many people that were involved, but the vast majority of the people were not. The vast majority of children, particularly high school children, they were involved. My sister-in-law, she was actively involved. She's sitting there. Her father was involved with the jail and spent 2 weeks in jail and vowed that he would not leave jail until the society was changed. He only stayed 2 weeks, but that was more time than I would have stayed. Yes, but yeah, you're right. That was a concerted effort, and there were, people came together because of the vastness of the terror that was going on in Birmingham and around the South.
Were there any more questions? Dr. Huntley,
Yes, sir.
let's talk money. Could you share with the audience the importance of a balance in the movement between politics and business, such as the Maynard Jackson model that you've talked about in the past?
In Atlanta was different than Birmingham. Atlanta was an educational center. Birmingham was a working class center. In Atlanta, it was different than Birmingham. In 1960, there was an opportunity for the Birmingham Barons to go into AAA baseball for Birmingham as well as for Atlanta. The Atlanta's team was called the Atlanta Crackers. And they were all white. And the Atlanta Crackers decided to integrate. And they got one black baseball player. Birmingham decided they were not going to integrate. They would not have, so they disbanded the team. That sort of gave an indication of where the two cities were going. Of course, the Atlanta team would become the Atlanta Braves. They moved from Milwaukee to Atlanta. The headquarters of Coca-Cola would be in Atlanta. The headquarters of Delta Airlines would be in Atlanta. many of the big businesses would come to Atlanta rather than to Birmingham. But if you notice, if you look at the map, you notice that Birmingham really is the center of that southeastern region. You have Birmingham here, you have Memphis, you have Nashville here, you have Memphis here, you have New Orleans here, you have Atlanta over here, you have, so Birmingham really was in the center, but because of the way in which U.S. Steel controlled Birmingham, it controlled Birmingham. It would not allow certain things to take place. So the business piece was vitally important in Atlanta, which would lead into the political arena. In Birmingham, there was little business, no politics as far as blacks were concerned, and we know that Maynard Jackson would be the first black mayor of Atlanta, and he made a statement. And they were building the international airport there, the largest airport in the world now, I believe. He said to the powers that be, the money people in Atlanta, that if black people did not get at least 50% of what was being built, then that would not be an airport, an international airport. And so the political piece was so important because we had a Maynard Jackson. But if you notice, not in any other city around this country did that happen, except possibly Chicago with Mayor Washington. No other mayor, black mayor who was coming aboard would have the initiative to do what a Maynard Jackson did. And obviously not in Birmingham, it did not happen. But you're right, politics and the business plays a very, very important part.
Any more questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Is that Steve?
I was wondering if you could see back this far, man. What's happening, Horace? I was,
Let me just say about Steve. Steve Winfield actually was one of those folk at the University of Minnesota during the period who was his brother, Major League Baseball player. Steve actually was a better baseball player than Dave. He actually gave up his career to be involved in the movement. And we need to applaud him for that. And he's very modest. He didn't want me to say it, but you can't whoop me, so.
well, I appreciate that vote of confidence. I was just gonna do just a quick reflection in terms of thinking about when we were in Morrill Hall and we were talking about how some of the parents, in terms of reaction, and I can remember how my mother was, fearful of, what might, happen to us and things like that. And it was interesting because there were the different, and by the way, and I'll talk to you about it later, actually me and Carl Brown, a couple other people made a year later, made a recording of, we kind of did a thing, and it was on a reel-to-reel. I said, let's take you back to that year, that date, and we kind of did a thing and the reenactment of Morrill Hall thing and things around it. But one of the things was the community and how it reacted towards us, and there were the parents who were afraid and worried about us. And then there were the folks that said, oh man, I ain't doing the helping them bourgeois niggas up in that place, and so forth. So, like you said, there were different people, had different feelings, you know, about it and things. And I could think of, then as my mother was afraid, and thinking, well, why do you guys have to say black, and what's wrong with Negro, and things. And then I had another aunt who said, you know, Arlene, you know, well, maybe if we would have done some of these things earlier, then these kids wouldn't have had to do, you know, whatever. So there was just interesting different things. And the last thing I just thought about some of the, I can remember when, you know, we were doing the demands, and people said, well, should we ask for, you know, maybe some more classes, some more programs? And I remember, I don't know if it was Mahmoud who said it or whoever, but it said, should we might as well, let's shoot for the stars, let's ask for a department, you know, because they can get rid of programs and classes easier than it's harder to get rid of a whole department. And then years later, and seeing the history in the other departments that came out of that effort, and, you know, even though, you know, there's some struggles and things, but they're still there, where there are a lot of the other colleges across the country that had different programs and things like that. The University of Minnesota is, and you know it better than I do, it's one of the few universities that still have something standing there. So I can just appreciate some of that history and some of the efforts of some of the people in this room, and, you know, I've supported it along the way. So just wanted to say that, man. It sure is good to see you, man.
Any other questions?
Well, where's Rose? Rose, did you want to say something about the upcoming event, please?
Hi, I'm Rose Brewer. I'm a professor in the Department of African-American Studies. You know, we've been dealing with some tough weather this week. We had scheduled on Tuesday day-long teach-in that we postponed. The good news is that it will be happening February 25th, and all of you are invited. Get your calendars out and write it in. More information will be coming out. Dr. Huntley will be returning, and we'll have a full day of teaching activities. As a matter of fact, we'll have a year-long set of recognitions of this milestone event, 50 years. And the idea that we're still standing means that a whole lot of people have made it possible over the years for that to happen. It's been a struggle. The catalyst, of course, was the takeover of Morrill Hall, but 5 decades mean a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And we want to tell that story in its inception, but over the years also. So you all are all invited. In the spring, we'll have a second teach-in, bringing in the voices of some of the women who have played a role in this political struggle. In the fall, we'll have a student symposium, and we'll have also a fundraiser gala event, giving recognition to leadership such as those who have gone, who have transitioned, especially Ms. Rose Freeman, and it really is important. Anna Stanley also. She will be recognized in the April celebration, and just lots to do. I don't know, do I need to leave any other information except to say that you'll have...
It'll be on our website.
On their website. And thank you, Dr. Huntley, for being here this week. We had a marvelous time. He was in my class at the beginning of the week. I think we talked about that naming question in my 1011 Introduction to African American Studies course. Thank you.
So, thank you, Jimmy, for your work in drawing Horace out. And Horace, thank you for sharing all of this. Thanks, everyone, for witnessing. Don't be in a hurry to leave. Stay and visit with each other. If you didn't sign the guest book, please sign the guest book. pick up flyers for upcoming events and activities here and carry on the spirit. Thank you.